Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
The three candidates for the United States Senate debated last night. There weren't many surprises, but there was some ganging up on the incumbent, James McClure. We'll get some analysis of that debate tonight. We'll also get an 11th hour look at the Hanson-Stallings race for Congress in the 2nd District and hear from some reporters about how the election looks to them on the weekend before the Idaho vote.
Good evening. 3 days left now until the voting, and the candidates are trying to cram as much as possible into the last 72 hours of the political campaign. Tonight, with 3 of the state's top political reporters, we'll be sampling the 11th hour political situation in Idaho's U.S. Senate, congressional, and state legislative races. First tonight, a look at the debate last night between the 3 candidates, or I should say among the 3 candidates for the United States Senate. What a difference a political campaign can make. Just 4 years ago, everyone in Idaho who cares about politics was talking about the Senate race then between Steve Sims and Frank Church. Their face-to-face debate just days before the election was front-page news all over Idaho. Last night, Republican Senator James McClure, widely regarded as a shoo-in for re-election, debated his 2 opponents. It wasn't exactly a dull show, but not designed either to win big Nielsen ratings. The major subject was wilderness and the failure of the Congress to pass this year an Idaho wilderness bill. McClure labeled last night as fraudulent and a hoax reports that the Forest Service is now ready to build hundreds of miles of roads in areas now roadless in Idaho.
If you want to look for a moment at what their plans are for the next year, the plans are very modest indeed and about in line with the annual road building plans with respect that actually occurred during the last 4 years. So there is no massive road building program planned. That charge is simply a fabrication and a hoax.
Mr. Bush, your rebuttal.
It's very difficult to accept in good faith those comments when the paper and the Idaho Statesman and the different magazines recently have been touting the dangers and the 10,500 roads that are being permitted to be built here in Idaho. In Montana and Idaho, they've decreased the budget by 40% for trail maintenance. They've decreased the budget by 40% for wildlife habitat and have increased the budget for road building. I'd suggest that possibly your figures are about as accurate as some of your other theories.
Mr. Billings, your rebuttal.
I think what we're seeing here is a classic example of the way in which when we politicize things, we have warfare. We have seen Cyberling and Senator McClure and the wilderness groups and the timber interest and the mining interest and the various commercial interests at each other's throats, and that's what's to be expected when we turn to the political process to allocate resources.
Both Bush and Billings took shots at McClure over the size of the federal deficit, and both proposed cuts in military spending.
It would seem to me that the first thing we need to do to cut the deficit would be to eliminate these threatening projects that have nothing to do with our defense and cut the MX missile, chemical nerve gas, neutron bombs, the high frontier type program, military aid to any foreign dictator, for example in Central America, and try to get on with developing our economy based upon goods and products and agriculture rather than this military buildup.
I think what we've got to recognize is that government is an inefficient institution. We're going to have them provide our defense, but they're going to do it rather inefficiently. So I believe when we're talking about $175 billion budgets each year, the only way we can cut the defense budget significantly is to reorganize, rethink our basic foreign policy posture. Should the United States of America be the policeman of the world? Should we in fact try to have a world in our image? I think we should move in the direction of a policy of strategic disengagement, of free trade, free investment, but radically alter our foreign policy, bring the 300,000 Rhine Army men home from Western Europe, and that's the way we can cut the defense budget.
I've been hearing this rather loose talk about balancing the budget by cutting defense. Let's just stop for a moment and think what would happen if indeed we tried to cut $175 billion out of defense in order to balance the budget this year. Out of a total of $272 billion. You wouldn't have a standing army, you wouldn't have a ready navy, you wouldn't have any defense at all, no matter where you tried to stage that defense, no matter what kind of a foreign policy we had. So it is ridiculous to assume that you can balance the budget simply by addressing defense. Yes, there is waste in the defense program. Yes, that defense program can accept some of the discipline that is necessary in order to get a balanced budget. And I support those cuts that are prudent, but still we must remember that the function of government is to defend the American public, the rich, the poor, the old, the young, the men, the women, the children in this country deserve that primary duty of this country to be able to defend ourselves against foreign aggression.
Billings went after McClure over a recent report suggesting that the senator was one of the biggest pork barrel spenders in the Congress.
In the closing days of this session, you continued this practice of voting boondoggle pork barrel spending programs, the bailout of the Kennedy Performing Arts Center, the $4.9 billion sin fuel pork barrel for the Union Oil Company and Occidental Petroleum.
And I don't say that I rationalize those actions. I'll explain them, and I wish the professor had done his homework before asking the question. I make no apology at all for defending the power rates of the Northwest against the market-based studies that some people were urging, so that the government could make a profit out of its sales and not just recover its money. I make no apology for having defended the people in Idaho and the taxpayers of this country by fighting against dumping silver on the market and depressing the market and selling it below market rates. It doesn't take a genius to know that if you've got in hand twice annual production, you dump it all on the market at the same time, the price is going down. The taxpayers would be hurt, so would be the working men and women who live in Silver Valley in North Idaho. And I think that's my duty to protect their interests.
Some day after analysis of that debate now with Rod Grammer, the political editor of the Idaho Statesman newspaper in Boise. Rod was one of the questioners on the panel of reporters last night. With Jim Fisher, who covers politics for the Lewiston Morning Tribune in Lewiston. Jim is with us tonight in Moscow. And Brad Bugger, who covers politics for the Idaho State Journal in Pocatello, and that's where he joins us tonight. Rod, this has got to be perhaps certainly one of the most, if not the most, lopsided United States Senate race anywhere in the country.
Oh, it has to be, Mark. Yeah. McClure is just really a shoe-in. Some people think he may win as high as 70% of the vote this year.
Is he vulnerable on any of these issues if a better financed candidate were running against him?
I think so, Mark. I think a lot of people think he is unbeatable, he is unchallengeable, but I think that a good candidate with a lot of money and good organization could make an issue of all these things that were brought up last night. Problem is, in this campaign, Pete Bush and Don Billings have differences with McClure, but they don't have the money, organization, or the experience, or sometimes the ability to make issues of them.
Brad, how's this race look to you? Is McClure vulnerable on any of these issues if he had a real competitive candidate against him?
Well, Mark, I think that some of the issues that were brought up last night, I don't think he is vulnerable on it. For example, attacking a strong national defense is like attacking him on gun control. The people of Idaho want a strong national defense, and I don't think he is vulnerable on that issue. There are some issues I think he might be vulnerable on. I think if somebody probed a little deeper into his spending record, for example, the Grace Report, which has just been released, and the Sin Fuels bill, Western Water Projects, the in lieu tax payments, that kind of thing, I think if people probe that voting record a little closer, he could be vulnerable on that, but like Rod said, it would take somebody much better financed than Pete Bush.
Jim, thoughts on the Senate race?
Well, I was surprised last night that no one hit on what I think would make McClure especially vulnerable up in the north, and that is his continued support for George Hansen. He began early in the campaign by saying that Hansen should still be considered innocent in the eyes of the law, even though he has been convicted of 4 felonies, and many people up here find that a strange argument, and I was surprised that he wasn't hit with it last night.
Let me just ask you all, Brad mentioned the Don Billings raised the issue of McClure being a pork barreler, one of the big spenders on these special interest projects. Is that true?
Well, Mark, I think so. I think McClure talks about protecting his constituents, but I think that's what 100 senators and 435 congressmen say the same thing back in Washington. Some things he's got points on, and indeed he is voting for his constituents, but at the same time, many of these things do contribute to the cost of government, and I think it just depends on whose ox is being gored.
Depends, I guess, Jim, on Well, I guess that maybe makes the point that a lot of people make about how difficult it is to cut the federal budget when you've got every United States senator protecting his constituents.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure it's just constituents either. You've seen the very long list of his contributors, and that raises another question that was not raised last night, is McClure's opposition to a federal bill that would outlaw utilities charging ratepayers for their construction work in progress. Does that serve any constituents in Idaho?
Brad, let me ask you finally about this Senate race. By the fact that Don Billings was on the same platform with these guys last night, does that legitimize the libertarian movement a little bit?
Well, I really don't know, Mark. We haven't seen much out of the libertarian movement on a statewide basis. I thought Mr. Billings looked, I was more impressed by the way he performed last night than I was by Pete Bush, frankly. But I think the thing about any libertarian candidate is that they can always fall back on a locked-in ideology, and they have a locked-in answer for every issue or every question, and that allows them to look good and to sound good in a forum like last night, but it's really not very practical politics when you get right down to it. I mean, coming into Idaho and saying, let's give away all the federal land isn't really going to sail. And so I don't know if the libertarian movement will ever be a mainline, viable movement until they move away from their locked-in ideology.
Okay, well, the three of you stay where you are. We'll be back to you in a moment. There is, of course, virtually no doubt, as we've suggested here, about the outcome of that Senate race. There is considerable doubt about the fate of Congressman George Hansen in the 2nd Congressional District of Idaho. Hansen blitzed the district yesterday with 2 Utah Republicans. The message they were bringing was clear. Hansen's campaign violations were minor infractions and should not be an issue in his battle with Richard Stallings. Hansen sounded awfully upbeat.
Things look good here in Boise. I think they're picking up well in the Magic Valley, and it looks very good for a victory. But so right here in the last stages of the election, I'm real pleased to kind of put the crowning touch on it with my 2 good friends from Utah, Senator Hatch, Congressman Hansen. Senator, maybe you'd like to lead off.
Utah Republican Orrin Hatch praised Hansen's voting record, predicted that he would win election next Tuesday, and essentially poo-pooed the congressman's felony convictions for financial disclosure violations.
And we determined it. Now, I believe that George will win this case on appeal. But be that as it may, I'm sure he wished he had filed everything they wanted him to file. But the day after his indictment, as I understand it, 225 of his colleagues in Congress changed their ethics returns. Now, I think it's pretty clear that George has been made a scapegoat for a lot of people back there.
Meanwhile, Democrat Richard Stallings was speaking before students at the LDS Institute in Pocatello, looking confident and telling stories about his campaigning against George Hansen.
I was working one of the fairs, and a young lady came by and I shook hands with her, and she says, I introduced myself and I said, I'm running for Congress, and she said, why, are you a crook? I was a little offended by that. And I said, heavens no, I'm not a crook. I've tried to maintain a level of integrity. I'm not a crook. And she says, if you go back there, you will be soon, because they have one of the greatest on-the-job training programs in the country.
After his speech, Stallings told producer Paula Whistle he was still worried about a last-minute smear from Hansen.
Oh, I kind of expect perhaps an abortion smear or some other kind of wild, unsubstantiated statement that'll be hard for me to defend in the last couple of days.
Let's get our reporter's view of this race just as the weekend before the election begins. First from Brad Bugger in Pocatello. Brad, did the Orrin Hatch, Jim Hansen, George Hansen trip across the state have any effect yesterday?
Well, I don't know, Mark, because they didn't appear here in Pocatello, so we didn't get a chance to see how they performed. I think that it very well could influence some strongly Republican voters. As this week goes on, the inference is building more and more that Reagan, the Reagan landslide, and also the possibility that they could win enough House seats that, combined with the Southern Democrats, they could form a coalition to run the House, in effect. I think that's the most convincing argument that George Hansen can make right now, and I think the appearance of Orrin Hatch and Jim Hansen simply backs up that argument, or reminds people that of the possible Reagan landslide and the possible effects the Hansen race could have as far as having a Republican member in a strongly Republican House.
Rod, how do you size it up?
Well, Mark, I don't think they probably had much influence on terms of Georgia's legal problems. Nothing was said yesterday that hasn't been said before, but I agree with Brad that they could have an effect in terms of this snowball effect. This week we've had a tremendous number of Idaho Republican leaders endorse Hansen in ads all across the district. And I think that, in combination with a couple of Utah congressmen coming into the state, just builds this whole image of we need George to support President Reagan and keep the House, you know, or get a balance in the House.
This really is a race going down to the wire.
I think so. I think so. I think it's going to be close, although I think Stallings has the edge right now.
Brad, is it really a race right down to the wire?
Well, I think so, definitely, Mark. I was talking to both Bill Hansen and Paul Pugmire, Stallings' aide, today about the difference in the race, and what it comes down to basically is who's going to win Twin Falls County. And even though Stallings is confident he's going to win Twin Falls County, he's only predicting a 2 percentage point victory there. That's a very small margin to base an entire election on, and I would say a very fragile margin. So I'd say, yeah, the election is definitely still up for grabs.
Jim Fisher in Moscow, you're out of this district, but I know you watched this race a lot. Rod mentioned the Republican endorsements. You said earlier that you thought, at least in northern Idaho, that might hurt a Jim McClure. We've had, virtually, I guess, every Republican except Larry Craig, I believe, Rod, appearing in those ads. How does that strike you, Jim?
Well, I think Larry Craig, if you remember a week ago during his debate with Bill Heller, he was asked about George Hansen, and he did say, and I don't think he particularly wanted to say it, but he was led to say that if he lived in the 2nd District, he would vote for George Hansen. I think that would probably hurt him a little bit here, not a great deal. Rod was talking about the legal question before, and again, on the tape we just saw, Orrin Hatch was saying the same thing that George Hansen has been saying the entire time. First of all, I didn't do anything wrong, and besides, a number of other people were doing the same thing. Well, I remember when I was thrown in jail for drinking beer when I was 18, and I tried to sell the same argument to my folks, and it didn't wash.
And true confessions here tonight. Last-minute smear, is that something that Stallings should be concerned about, or is that part of the hype going into the last couple of days?
I think it's a combination, Mark. It's something he should be concerned about, but obviously Stallings has been building the public, preparing the public for this for about 3 weeks now, getting them ready in case something does, and if it comes about, he's ready. If not, nothing lost.
Brad, you heard Stallings say on that videotape a moment ago that this is a typical Hansen technique in the closing days of the campaign. Is that right, or is that fair?
Well, I really don't know. I'm relatively new to the political scene, so I can't say if it's something that George has used in the past, although everybody seems to echo that. Everybody seems to say, well, you know, watch out for the last couple of weeks because George will hit you with something. In this case, I don't know what he could hit Stallings with. I heard Cecil Andrus make a speech on behalf of Stallings to a bunch of Democrats a few weeks ago, and he said, I don't honestly know what anybody could smear Richard Stallings with, and I think that pretty much sums it up. Richard Stallings, you know, Hansen's made a big deal about Richard not having any political experience or record, but by the same token, he has absolutely nothing that he could be smeared with or attacked on.
Okay. We'll spend the rest of our time tonight on the state legislative races, where most of the attention has focused on really about 10 state Senate races across Idaho. For about 25 years now, Idaho Republicans have had the majority in the Idaho legislature, but they have never had a 2/3 majority in both houses. This year, there is an even money chance that they will get 2/3 in the state Senate. They already have it in the House, and both sides are saying that will be very close.
There's a reasonable chance, but it's going to wait. We're going to have to wait and see when all the votes are counted. We have 23 seats really that are lead pipe cinches, that either they're unopposed or have token opposition. We have 3 more that really are odds on that the Republicans are going to get them, which takes us up to 26. There are 3 more that there are truly question marks behind that could go either way. So we need 28, of course, and it's going to be very close. It's going to be within 1 or 2 of the 28.
I think it's about the same as it is every year. We skate pretty close to the thin edge, well, for the last 3 or 4 elections anyway, but I think that we will end up with at least 1/3 of the senators.
Republicans are able to gain a veto-proof state Senate, that could mean another political fight over the divisive issue of right to work. Governor Evans has vetoed right-to-work bills in the past, and Republicans have lacked the votes to override those vetoes. But right-to-work supporters across Idaho, sensing a potential political victory here, have entered the fray in 2 key state Senate races. Gary Richardson has that story.
They maintain that my opponent has nothing to do with the ads. However, he has done nothing to stop them.
I didn't authorize them to put them in, but from my observation, they were stating the truth on them, and I don't have any hard feelings about them.
I do not object to them. I had nothing to do with them, but it's my feeling.
They are talking about a series of newspaper ads and radio spots run in legislative districts 12 and 22.
The choice is clear. Mondale Weatherall against right to work, or President Reagan and Senator Walt Yarborough for right to work and more jobs for Idaho.
Why do you oppose right to work, Mr. Peavy? We deserve an answer before Election Day.
Paid for by the Idaho Employee Rights Campaign Committee.
Gary Glenn is treasurer of the Employee Rights Campaign Committee.
We are confident that an overwhelming majority of the people in those 2 districts support the right to work concept. We know that simply from the demographic makeup and as well as consistent polling that we have done over the years. In fact, the Magic Valley, according to polls we've done over the years, is the strongest pro-right-to-work area of the state.
While Trounsden and Yarborough do not take credit for the ads, they are willing to take a stand on the issue, as are Peavy and Weatherall.
I think that right to work improves the union. It makes the union more competitive. And I think the unions have a very good place in our lifestyle. But I don't like to see any organization having complete control without something with competition to balance it.
I'm for right to work. When I came back from the service, after 5 years in the service, I had to join a union before I could get a job and go to work. And I didn't think this was right. Now, I'm not opposed to unions, but I think a union should be like any other organization. If we want to belong to it voluntarily and support it, we should. But I don't believe anybody should have a right to force you to belong to something to make a living for your family.
Well, I've always felt that the right-to-work people were an out-of-state, unhealthy influence in Idaho politics. It's a very divisive group. It's an anti-labor group. It makes it when a group of people want to go together and join and form a union for whatever purpose, it makes their organization very ineffective. That's what a right-to-work bill does.
These people that are funding these ads and are doing this work are bringing money in from West Virginia and interfering with the operation of the legislation in the state of Idaho.
I would feel safe in saying that every dime that paid for those ads was raised here in Idaho. We do receive money from out-of-state sources, but we receive significant portions that we raise here in the state, and we certainly did not spend enough on these particular races that we would have gone above what we have been able to raise from Idahoans.
Is a veto-proof Senate the reason for interjecting right to work into the 2 key Senate races?
The ultimate purpose of our efforts, and it has been the ultimate purpose since the effort began, is to enact a right-to-work law in the state of Idaho. It will come eventually. The people will decide when, obviously. And it'll be totally up to the people's hands this November as to whether or not they will elect a sufficient number of legislators to allow it to become law in the near future.
Clearly, right to work is one of the issues at stake should Republicans gain control of the state Senate. Rod Grammer, let me ask you about a couple of these races. Both of those races we saw there, Weatherall and Yarborough, 2 incumbents running against each other, Trounsden and Peavy, 2 incumbents running against each other. The Democrats have got to win those races if they're to prevent a veto-proof Senate.
There are 2 of the 5 races, in my opinion, Mark, they have to win. But I was just going to make a point that those aren't the only 2 races Right to Work's been involved in. It's been involved in almost all the key Senate races across the state, going clear up to Dennis Carlson up in northern Idaho and as far east as Rusty Barlow and Pocatello. They're all over the map in this election.
Do you have a prediction on either of those races or any of the others that are on your 5 list?
Well, Mark, I think that the Democrats will win at least 4 of those races, and the other one looks pretty close, the Salaz-Rakosi race here in Ada County. Right now, Salaz probably has the edge, but I think that one could go either way from what I understand.
Okay. Jim Fisher in Moscow, how do you read the Republican chances of gaining enough votes to, at least in theory all the time, override a governor's veto?
Well, Jim Risch is a pretty shrewd politician, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with anything that he said. I think it's going to be very, very close. Prominent Republicans from Cecil Andrus to Governor John Evans to Democratic Chairman Mel Morgan are predicting 16 or 17 Democratic Senate seats. I think that means that they hope they get 16 or 17 Democratic Senate seats, and they know it's going to be very close, too.
Well, perhaps the closest race in the northern Idaho area is that Carlson-Reed matchup in Kootenai County. Have a feel for that?
As far as I can tell, that's going to be very close. I think Mary Lou Reed was dealt a blow when Carlson did manage to unseat Bill Moore in the primary. If Moore were her opponent now, I think there would be a significant number of anti-Moore votes that might cancel out some of the anti-Reed votes. She's been around a long time. She does have enemies. Carlson's a newcomer. He doesn't have as many enemies. So it depends upon whether her campaigning, and she's a tremendously active campaigner, can counteract some of those enemies that she has made.
Brad Bugger in Pocatello, as Rod suggested, right to work has been an issue in the Horsch-Barlow race, another critical one for the Floterial seat in your part of the state. How are you reading that one tonight?
Well, Mark, I think the right to work is finally coming home to roost in the Horsch-Barlow race. Dwight Horsch is a very positive, a very friendly guy, but at the same time that may be a downfall of his. He refuses to attack Rusty on his record on right to work, and of course the big issue over here is funding for ISU, and he's refused to attack Rusty on his past voting record on higher education. But the unions are finally getting active. They held a press conference today to attack Rusty for including some local union leaders in a brochure of his on the NPR vote, and they also managed to, of course, mention the fact that Rusty is a right-to-work supporter. I think that is finally coming home to roost here in Bannock County, but I think it's still going to be a very close race, and a lot of it will depend on, number one, how big the turnout is in Bannock County, and they're expecting a record turnout, and number two, if that record turnout is largely Democratic, as people assume it is, or if it contains some of the new young Republicans we keep hearing so much about.
Let me just quickly ask you for a prediction. Can Republicans get a veto-proof Senate, do you think?
I think it's going to be very close. Some people I've talked to are predicting that the Democrats will get the bare minimum 15, and that's assuming that John Peavy loses his race. So I would say that the Democrats will barely hang on to 15.
Well, we're out of time. Brad, thank you for joining us tonight in Pocatello. We appreciate it. Jim Fisher in Moscow, good to have you with us, Jim. Thank you. And Rod Grammer, thank you, Rod. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back here on Monday when we'll look at the 3 issues that will be on next Tuesday's ballot for you to decide. We'll see you then. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.